Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's really wonderful to see you all gathered here after such a disturbing and horrifying week last week. So wonderful to have you all together so we can think deeply about what we have ahead and hopefully restore and refresh and reflect about the future. My name is Shannon Jackson. I am the Associate Vice Chancellor for Arts and Design here at UC Berkeley. And on behalf of our many co-curators across departments, including the Arts Research Center and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese tonight, it is a tremendous privilege to welcome you to tonight's event. I also want to do a particular shout out to our student clubs who are represented in helping support tonight, the A+D Student Committee, the CREATE Committee for Arts and Public Education through the Public Service Center, and the BAM-PFA Student Committee. Thank you all for being you. All right, I have the distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce our speaker tonight, Tania Bruguera, an internationally renowned artist and activist hailing from Cuba, whose work has an international reputation. She received her MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 2001, and since then has gone on to have a 20-year career that has taken her all across the globe, crisscrossing many parts of the world and crisscrossing borders as well. It would be impossible to list all of Bruguera's many accomplishments here, but let me tell you, they include countless gallery exhibitions and installations at committed and small municipal spaces in Los Angeles, Tijuana, Caracas, Chicago, Vancouver, as well as installations in major mega institutions such as the Guggenheim, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, or London's Tate Modern Hayward Gallery, Berlin House of World Culture, and Paris's Pompidou Center. Bruguera's work has, for many of us, also become a kind of mainstay in the discourse and practice of socially engaged art, and she's a mainstay in the biennial circuit as well, appearing in the landmark 2002 Documenta 11, and going on to be featured in biennials in Bogota, Buenos Aires, Istanbul, Johannesburg, Moscow, Shanghai, Venice, and many others. She's given TED Talks, she's lectured at museums and universities around the world, she's been a visiting faculty member at many universities and schools from Salzburg to San Francisco, and the recipient of many prizes, including a Guggenheim in 1998. The overview only begins to sketch the influence that she has had on so many of us, especially when it comes to what it means to join pedagogy and politics into the practice of art. Along the way, she's redefined what it means to be an artist and what art actually means. Her work often is in constant and deep collaboration with institutions, with community centers, with citizens, to create long-term durational projects where she often positions herself less as a genius artist, although she is, but also as an initiator, someone who initiates practices that other citizens take up and carry forward. That impulse and what she's known for in that practice informs how I hear a quote that can be inconspicuously found in her website. She has a quote from Aristotle where she said, that reads, "For the things we have to learn before we do, we learn by doing." Learning by doing. Bruguera's current survey at the exhibition at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, a partnering organization tonight, her exhibition, Talking to Power, offers a dynamic overview of the depth and breadth of Bruguera's long-term socially engaged art projects. And in walking through the exhibition, one realizes just how much learning by doing she has been doing throughout her practice, these 20 years. Tonight, Bruguera will be speaking to us more about that work, about Arte Útil, useful art, and also giving us some guidance about what new forms of learning and what deep forms of doing might be necessary for us to initiate in order to create a world worth living in. So, Tania, thank you. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Shannon, for those nice words. Some I don't accept like genius, but okay. Um, but I also want to thank the collaboration Berkeley had at a very important um, part of the show at the YBCA, which was the Escuela, the School of Arte Útil. Thank you for that, Alan de Souza. And also, I want to thank Julia, yeah, you and Brian Wilson, who has been a long uh, person with whom I've been reading and discussing as well of Shannon text. Thank you for that. I'm especially, one second, I have to sit down. I'm especially happy to be here today because what it means Berkeley in terms of the history of freedom of expression in this country. And also because it's not a coincidence that those who have to fake their beliefs never show up, if you know what I'm talking about. So basically today I'm going to have a quick overview of my practice as a way to kind of share with you how I got here. And I'm going to do for the first time something I had not, so we'll see how it goes. But I'm going to show you the work. I'm going to show you what is the things that, let's say, motivate me to do this work. But also I'm going to say what trouble it got me into in a very quick sentence, and what I had to deal with, either politically or institutionally, because of that work. And I think that's important because sometimes I talk about my work in this kind of like everything is good, we are all happy, but actually each of these work have come out of let's say compromises, which I don't do very much, but but you understand that you have to create a dialogue when you do political art. You cannot come with your ideas and impose it. You have to have this kind of interrelationship with what's going on and the people who are part of it. But also, all of them had brought me some sort of dilemmas, ethical dilemmas, or personal dilemmas. And I do think that political art is art with consequences. So I feel like as a political artist, one of the first things that I do, and some of my friends who do political art do, is thinking on how this is going to be used by other, how this is going to be understood by other, and what are the consequences, the actual political consequences of your acts. And I think when I work with curators in new projects, they always get confused because I spend much more time trying to imagine how the work is going to be received and what is the potential outcome and problems that it will happen than actually how is it going to look. And this is interesting because a lot of people have thought for a while that I use shock. My work is so like shocking, and all of this is a stage. It's a stage of the shock in order for people to wake up. So I want to start with some of my older works. Before that, I want to, well, you will see that another thing that I have done as a political act in my work is to create words. Many times I have the opportunity to have discussions with amazing critics or other artists, and sometimes I get a little pissed off because we go into a direction that my work is not going to. And I felt for a long time that part of that is because we're using a language that doesn't belong to the practice. So I feel for a while now that part of the role of the artist is also, together with the critics and the art historians, try to find out a new language for what we're doing, in order to be more clear, but also in order to invite people to rethink what we're doing. So ética is one of those terms, and in Spanish is estética, aesthetics, but with a little hyphen. So it is ethics. And I'll talk about it a little later. And I think for me, the idea of the aesthetics in proposing new ethics is what I'm trying to work with in my work. So I'm going to show you how. So the first question I feel like we have to deal with right now is, what is art for? For many years, I think people have understood now for whom we do the art, how we do the art, where we do the art, and all of these questions kind of belong to certain movements. But I feel for a while now that the question for me and for a group of other artists actually is shared is what is art for? I think that for too long we have assumed this kind of tradition that come from 100 years ago, 1917, where we have these two paradigms, 100 years old, should be enough time for them to be in the pedestal. And of course, part of the discussion that had come out of it is okay. Yes, one is changing things out of places and out of function in order to become something to look at and not to be used. Some people are like, okay, but this is the tension between art and life. Do you bring art into the museum, or do you bring the museum into life outside, and so on? Part of the discussions that critics have of both is like, at the end, if you try to bring art into the museum, if you're trying to make to clean, hygienize, let's say, art from its relationship with the context and life of people, then you end up producing something that has a life in the market. And the other side say, yeah, but if you do the other stuff, you're doing propaganda. So we have still this discussion for 100 years that I think we need to deal with. And in my case, I think I have two main influences as an artist. One is definitely the Russian constructivism, this idea of the utopia, realizable utopias, the idea that art should be not for a gallery or for, as we all know, this kind of almost cleaning money machine that is the art galleries. And the other influence is that I'm from Cuba, a country that became the repository of the utopias of the world. Like, everybody is Cuba. And actually, this is something I'm working on. I read in a book that Thomas More actually read. I don't know, you guys know more than me, so you cut me if I'm wrong. But I read in one history book that Thomas More read the diaries of Colón before he wrote Utopia. So there you go. If you want to be chauvinistic, use some philosophy. Okay, so then of course I'm born in Cuba, where it's a very contradictory place. But even when Fidel was, I think, somebody who overstayed in power and abused a little bit the fascination people had with him, it is a place where it's very difficult to find his image. So he understood that the best way to be in people's life is the best way to do politics is to be in people's life, everyday life. So I think that really influenced me. Of course, we had a situation where we felt our fights, the fights of the world, were our fights. Something I'm very proud of, although now it's not so much like that anymore in Cuba, but okay. And then we had, of course, the idea that everything is political, even religion. And of course, art was, as they call, a weapon of the revolution. So this is the ambience in which I developed my ideas of art. So yes, I did find out very, very early on that the same way that politics work with emotion, art work with emotion, and the same way that we are frustrated and we use art to put out our frustration, our hopes, etc., politics does it too. And then I decided a long time ago I wanted to transform all this affect, the unresolved affect, into some sort of political conduit that hopefully had some effectiveness. Okay, how I did that. So I had few working interests. I'll tell you which ones. I was a student in 85. When Ana Mendieta died, something happened, which was that she was the first Cuban that I met. That was, through her work, that was talking about territoriality in a very expansive way. Talking about being Cuban from New York, talking about the idea of identity, and for me it was not so much when she died the idea of the Cuba that is elsewhere, but it was more than anything the idea of the Cubans who were living and were not anymore part of the history of art in Cuba, and they were erased. But of course, I decided to redo all her work, and that created this relation with authorship that I still have. This idea that art is not something unique that somebody very special does, but is an ongoing cultural conversation. And of course, that made me think, okay, what is the role I have in society? If I'm not going to do this special painting that only I can do, what should I do? And then I realized that artists should do something else. And in this case, it was this kind of defender of the right for others who left Cuba to be part of history. And of course, the problem is that it had political implications. And what happened with this piece that I did very naively and very nicely was that the government in Cuba is very attentive, let's say. And they were already looking beyond my innocent act of reviving Ana Mendietas in Cuban culture by thinking the implication and the similarity this had with the fact that hundreds of Cubans left between 89 and 92. So of course it brought me political implications, because for the first time I was called and questioned why I'm doing that work in this kind of non-naive situation that opened my eyes. And then that was the moment I said, okay, anything that I do, no matter if it's emotional, personal, it is political. But it was not political because it was a statement. It was political because there would be a government looking at what you're doing and analyzing through a different lens, a lens of how they look through your work, which is an interesting relation with the audience. So I also did another piece where was taking the Nkisi Conde, a figure from the Congo culture, and Cuba is Afro-Cuban religion is more important than any other religion. And of course, we walk on the street and so on, and it was Fidel Castro's birthday. And this is about the promises not accomplished and so on. And of course, I wanted I said, okay, if I'm going to do political art, I want to do something everybody understands. I want to create a language that everybody understands. And then, of course, I said, okay, maybe because it's art, I can get away with a lot of stuff, if it's okay, if it's art. And then what happened is that one police came and he asked what is going on, very tensely. And the kids say, no, this is art. And he say, okay, then go on. And then as a political artist, I felt completely frustrated. And that was the moment that was very important for me, because it was the moment where I realized symbolism can be easily manipulated, but the direct experience is something you own as an audience. And therefore, it was a better way, a very territory for me to work as a political artist. But the other thing I understood that day is like, if I want to talk to power, I need to use the resources of power. I cannot go in this kind of marginal, symbolic conversation, because it's very easy for them to pretend it's not them. So I decided after that, to do my own newspaper, which today is still forbidden. This is 93, 94. And what I wanted to do with that is I wanted to do a newspaper that not only looked like a newspaper, but circulated as a newspaper and was desired as a newspaper. And with that, I realized that that was a great strategy, that the tension that you have between art and reality, I wanted to solve by what I call active hyperrealism, meaning intentionally trying to not only look like it is, but also make the thing operate as the thing that you are quoting, in this case, the newspaper. And then, of course, the other thing that I wanted to do is, because I was appropriating the resources of power, immediately I have a response from the people in power, because that's the language they understand. If you put a painting or a sculpture, that's a language we understand, and we understand the nuances, but I wanted to make sure they hear us. They hear what we needed to say, and they hear using art as a platform in a way. So, of course, that was a way for me to put propaganda to test. It always fails. No matter whose propaganda, it always fails. So, for me, active hyperrealism, as I explained, was this. But I also had, I'm not going to talk about this. Wow, okay. I also had this situation where I was doing a lot of performances, and I also realized at some point the body was a limit. Because as a performance artist, yeah, I could hand myself, like cut the arm. I mean, all of these extreme things that were actually refocusing on the person and not on society so much. Or let's say maybe it was used as a metaphor, but it was very easy for governments and for people in power to pretend it's something else. So I decided, instead of working with the limit of the body, to say, okay, I'm going to focus on what happens in society. So instead of performance, I was completely dedicated to use behavior as the main tool of my work. And of course, the idea of what is art for me is super important. Every time I do something people are not sure is art, I'm the happiest artist. When they know for sure it's art, I am not very happy. But another thing that I realized is, if I want to do political work as an artist, I also have to look for sustainable places for change. I understood that art is a temporary solution, is a band-aid sometimes, and sometimes you need to go together with some institution. This may be a bad example, but it's a good project. But General Assembly in the Human Rights Commission, they did this report on the field of cultural rights. So I think we were a group of artists invited to create this document, and I felt like, as an artist, I cannot only be in my studio creating political art, but I also had to be in the streets, and I also had to be in collaboration and with the other people who also want change. So, okay, some work lines, so understand. Okay, I work with the political imaginary, meaning I do art that that tries to play with the assumptions, political assumptions of people. In this case, I did this project where I show to foreigners the idea of what is Cuba. It's a tunnel that is totally dark with this little light at the end that had Fidel, who opens his chest to show that he has no protection, kind of superhero. And then, of course, when you turn around, you realize that you were next to naked Cubans, poor neighborhood Cubans, people. So I really like this idea of, for a long time, to play, not to counterpoint reality with assumptions, all the time. I also like to play with I use people professional experience. What I mean by that is, if you have, let's say, a mounted police who is invited in a museum to use all the resources they have for crowd control, even if they have been assigned a task, let's say, the true learning, the true self they become through their work will erase when something happens. Like, for example, in this case, a woman decided not to follow instruction. Immediately, this nice guard became this awful policeman who started pushing with a super big horse this woman to a corner. So I think for me it's very important to use also art as the space of the tryout of a potential future. I always say that my work is a staging of a future situation. That you have the chance through art to test who you will be in that situation or how will you behave in that situation. Then another thing is, for example, this piece, the political imaginary, is like this piece that you can see only through the peephole, you say, the hole of the door, if you don't want to participate. So in my work, there is always this thing where you have to decide: are you going to be an audience? Are you going to be a participant? Are you going to be engaged or to be safe? No. And then in this case, if you decide to go in, you are shown these beautiful monkeys and these beautiful eagles, and you choose who you want to take the portrait with, and it's being shown as a family portrait. People are very excited with this. Of course, the monkeys say McDonald, my kids, it's already showing in Russia. This was in Russia, the kind of moment. And then, of course, you get the photo, and then you have this beautiful photo. The problem is that the guy on the photo is the creator of the KGB. What is interesting is I work a lot with the historical memory. A lot of people didn't even remember who that guy was. And a lot of people thought it was a generic hero, which I'm very nervous because we are right now into this generic society that everything is generic. But okay. But the real damage is done when it's not generic. And of course, there are some people who are very proud from older generation. And for me, it was this idea of, okay, as an artist working in politics, what right do I have to go to another country to do work about that place? I don't live there. I don't understand the nuances. But I say, okay, in this case, what I can do is look at the elements in that other country that relates to my own experience in my own country or my own experience as a citizen, and try to share that dialogue with them. Another thing I do is recontextualizing the work. I very rarely put the work in two places. I usually try to understand the value of the work to be in contact as a detonator, let's say, of the situation in the place, so it cannot work the same way everywhere. So sometimes I recontextualize. In this case, I did this piece in Cuba, as I show you. And one thing that happened with this piece actually was that the police entered before the opening, and it was all dark because the piece was completely dark. And they say, "Come on, Tania, we know you by now, your tricks, put the lights on." And then, of course, the actors were not there, the guys from the neighborhood were not there, and there was no electricity to put the video, so they only saw the sugarcane on the floor. They were like, okay, it passed the censorship. And then, of course, once I put it on, it lasted like 2 hours. But and it's funny because I also think I realized Cuba. I don't know if you've been in Cuba. People are very almost naked in the streets. They're not so, they show off a lot. And then the justification for this, there is naked people. I'm like, art is full of naked people. What do you mean? But okay, so it's interesting to do work that put also censorship in ridicule, a little bit ridicule, But okay, so this piece, I was invited to actually Castle, and then I said, okay, let's do something. And I did the opposite. I created something completely bright where people were walking. And if you see, there is a woman with a gun on the corner. So it was, I always been, as an artist, also fascinated with the idea of art that is not visual. I always was interested in art as an experience. So I have been testing the limits of not seeing, in a way. But if you were in the right place, you find out that you had people with guns, real guns, cocking the gun. It was super hot, so people stay very little in the place. Yeah, so, and of course, the idea of integrating art to everyday life. So I do this a lot. Maybe one good example is the projects I did with immigration, that I have done with immigration. In this case, in Mexico, we brought 100 voceros. Voceros are the people who shout the news, so you buy the newspaper. And during the election time, we had these 100 people around the government buildings shouting the rights for immigrants. And then, of course, it was very funny. I don't know how it happened, but the last discussion in Mexico, they always bring the conversation about immigration in every presidential debate, but it's the Mexicans in the United States, not the immigrants in Mexico. So that's what we wanted to talk about, for them to realize that they're also part of that chain of, of immigration disgrace. So part of this, I was very happy when in the last debate, one of the candidates debated almost the 4 points we have been putting all the newspaper and everything. So that was yeah. And also we decided that the way to document this piece was to integrate this in one of the potential 50 new parties. So the way to signal that the work happened was to actually be part of the government's selection of the 50 new parties for the next election. Unfortunately, also I learned doing this work that the art spaces were limited because my exhibition finished. So all of this effort went nowhere because we were like registered as a party. We had all these ideas to go town by town doing these performances as a way to become a real party for immigrants. And then, of course, the art institution was preparing another show of another artist, and page was turned. So that was tough. And then, of course, I wanted to recognize at some point that the work I do, I cannot take full credit. And that's something I've been very clear about, that my work is the stage for something to happen. And if people don't do it, then it doesn't happen, so the work doesn't exist. In this case, I did, I put the microphone, and we gave people the instruction that they can say whatever they want for 1 minute, and that no censorship and so on. It was interesting because this is a photo of people talking, but there were moments where nobody was going, and it was for me the strongest part of the piece because it was almost a monument to fear, because everybody, like you could see the energy of people there, but nobody daring to go and talk. And well, a few people did, 46 actually. And one thing that we did is we put this element of the dove. That is something that comes from the Christianity, from the and it happens that Fidel, when he first in his first speech in Havana, a dove came and posed. It was very mystical, so we work with the magicians to train the dove, so they stay in people's shoulder. So we solved that discussion, that's political discussion for 50 years. But at the same time, we realized that the audience had a very big value when you do political art, and the value is the witnessing. I think I say often that I want to transform audience into active citizens, but also I realize that many times in front of political art, the audience become a witness that can attest not only that something did happen, but it can attest any injustice that happens to those involved in the piece. So I think that was a big discovery for me. Of course, that piece brought me a lot of problems. Yeah, that was it. So, okay, if I'm going to be a political artist, I'm guessing I'm a political initiator in a way. Another thing I do is the idea of time. It's very important for me to understand the use of time in my work. Everything we have seen so far is what I call short-term projects, meaning projects that can work in the time frame of an exhibition, in the time frame of the very small attention span people have in the arts, in the time frame of let's say a reaction to something that just happened. I feel that sometimes the short-term projects are a little violent because you have to compile in a very quick experience so many things. And sometimes the short-term projects are projects in which I do not aspire people to digest the piece or understand everything while it's happening, but later. A difference of that is a long-term project. A long-term project is projects that where people are involved in the process, where they go together for a while, and we have the discussion of the process together as it's happened. So I think it's a very different experience. Other concepts I use are the idea of institutional self-critique, which I really like because I also work with this idea of appropriating institutions and creating institutions in order to show the real institution, the critique. I also work with this idea of transitional institution, meaning understanding that the institution I'm creating is not for the pleasure of creating an institution and institutionalize it, let's say, and becoming a not-for-profit with a huge grants. No. They are institutional, transitional institution because they are popping up in order to bring the discussion about a problem, not to become, And an example of that is the school I did in Cuba, the Arte Útil, where we had all these guests, and we actually became a contestation of the art school in Cuba, and it was a way to show them that other ways could be done, and also it was a space where we actually, I was saying the other day, we actually created a space for true democratic discussion. It was very rare to people being able to decide the future of the project itself even. And of course we took some licenses that were not liked. And it was interesting because this project lasted 7 years, and I wanted, I brought to the group the idea of dissolving the project when I understood that the government was understanding how to co-opt the project. We also had this edge, very fine edge of critique, and then at some point the Minister of Culture really wanted to me to bring this to the actual school and to, it was all this, and I was like, no, it's time to close it, because if it's going to be, if it's, and that's very hard when you do long-term projects, because you have the responsibility with the people you're working with, but I think everybody understood that we didn't want to be used in that sense. Another thing is the Immigrant Movement International, which is a project in Corona, Queens, that now is being held by the museum. We passed the project. That's another way of finishing, let's say, the project. It was a project to bring empowerment to immigrants. So what we did is a series of educations using art and so on. But at some point, we pass it to the community through El Consejo, which is a council where people decide what to do with the project. And for me, that was very, very important, to give them the power, if it's empowering them to decide on the project. And we did a lot of actions. We did international action, and we also did this, which I really like, which is a postcard we gave immigrants to send their families, or a poster we did in Austria also. I know. And this is a flag we did for Europe, and who knows, now it's so current. It's interesting, this idea how art can envision the future. So I also use the idea of activating what is political, that is not showing itself as political. In this case, is the papacy and the church. And in this case, we did this signature campaign where we asked the Pope to give Vatican citizenship to all the immigrants in the world without papers, regardless their religion. You can go to YBCA and sign yours. And we hope to send it to the Pope. One of the things for me that makes it's hard when you do these long-term projects, say what is successful, what is not successful. One of the moments where I decided, okay, this has been a successful project, is when there was this woman, is a racist woman, who was part of the community board in Queens. And the immigrants, part of Immigrant Movement, the women, the mothers, decided they have this campaign to have a bicycle line to protect the kids. And then this woman, very racist, said, we don't know why you are coming here. Nevertheless, by the time this passed, you will be deported. And this is the moment I realized the project of Immigrant Movement has worked after working for so long. And part of the thing that happened with this long-term project is it almost feels that you have to create, let's say, an ethical ecosystem that takes time for people to get used to it. So when they go in the street and they don't feel the way they felt in the project, they know how to react and how to confront this. And in this case, the immigrant moms not only told her racist right there, but they actually created a campaign, including the mayor of New York. They included the mayor. They did a huge campaign, and this woman was removed from her post. So this, for you, is interesting to understand. It's important to understand that this woman who just did this gesture, that might be very little, but it was huge, and it was a good sign of we are not going to let you treat us that way, no matter who is the president right now, it is interesting to know that this woman a few years ago were so fragile, were so they lack so much tools to even, and I think that's what the project did. I mean, and that's the other thing, it's very hard to measure this in artistic terms, but we need to create terms for this in the arts, so, and this is how aesthetics come in. And one of the discussion I had was this idea, like, okay, I was with a good friend of mine, Claire Bishop, and she's like, okay, where is the aesthetic in all of this? And then she always put me these challenges. So, and then I was talking, and then show aesthetic, and actually Lucia San Roman was part of this discussion, and we decided that changing the H, and then I realized that in Spanish is easier because you only have to separate the word, and if you separate the word, est in Latin is it is. So basically, aesthetics mean it is ethics. So I really like this idea of understanding that the work I do is actually the proposition of a new ethical world of rules to be navigating through, Very quickly, so this arte de conducta, so as I said before, I stopped calling performance and I use behavior. And one example of this was in Colombia. Somebody here was in Colombia, just told me before. And this is an example of how behavior can be the work. In this case, I invited a series of desplazados, which is a program of the government trying to bring people outside of the conflict zone to the city. Somebody who had a family, missing family, somebody who was part of the guerrillas, and also a paramilitary inactive. Believe it or not, this tough guy was the only one who was there but didn't have the guts to appear in public. So yes, it happens in other countries too. So what happened is that we had all this boring discussion, what is a hero, how to solve the situation. And in the middle of this, a woman came out with a tray full of cocaine. This is in Colombia. So it is interesting because then people start consuming, the audience start consuming, and there was this tension, let's say, between the proper discourse and the people's will. And then at the end, what happened is like people took the microphone and start doing their own performance. And for me, I always say that the real performance is when they take the microphone and start saying, everything they wanted to say. And one of the things they were saying is like, who am I to go there to do that work? Which I think is totally legit, especially because the event I was part of, which was hosted by an American university in Latin America, telling them what performance art was in a way. So I think I wanted to highlight that. Yeah. So, okay, and the last thing I want to talk about is Arte Útil, very quickly. But Arte Útil is, let's say, a movement or a proposition on looking at a history of art that has been neglected, but it has happened there for the last 200 years. And we wanted to cut the attention of our historians and artists about this practice. It's a practice that comes before the urinal, that comes before this formulaic situation where if you remove the use of something, almost automatically becomes art. And where we understand that art can have a function other than pure aesthetics. Okay, so of course, part of the discussion is that we need to understand what is the function of our institutions today. We need to question not only what is art today, but also what are the institutions doing today and how they can become useful. And of course, part of that conversation is to understand or to bring this discussion about trying to see art not as production, but as implementation. How can we start approaching art as something that will be implemented instead of will be produced and then shown, or produced and acquired? And this is actually part of the discussion. And I'm going to leave it here. I have more stuff, but I want to make sure that we have time for questions. Thanks.
The microphones are coming out. Do you want to stay behind?
Yeah.
Maybe I'm forgetting the microphones. I'll just start off with one question. I had a lot of different things prompted and provoked, but I was interested in you talking about witnessing, because actually sometimes in socially engaged art we often talk about turning the receiver into a participant. Mm-hmm. And this notion of a witness is not quite that. Mm-hmm. And so I just wonder if you can talk about the witnessing as not passive reception, but also not exactly.
Mm-hmm. I always had problem with the idea of participation, because the way it's used many times is this kind of fake activation of like touching something or being. I really want. I prefer to rely in the idea of the person that keeps the event in its memory. And in the events, for me, my pieces are like I talk coming here to somebody who was in Colombia in that piece. And for me, that is the piece, the memory that is, being, yeah. So I think in this sense is witness, but also in the sense of having an active role. Because I also feel that participants sometimes almost feel like a script situation where you have to do this, you have to, like, you understand what is expected of you, and you enact and you perform the expectation more than having the freedom of maybe changing the work all along to something else that nothing expected, So I think that's my my conflict with participant, and I think I like witness. I want collaborator, other things. And also, I think we need to be honest. A lot of artists doing social engaged art depend on all these people being willing to be part of and giving their time. So we need to give them, the role, proper role, not just participate. You are participating in this event. That's it. You're sitting, you may ask question maybe, but then you go. But you're not collaborating. I mean, so I think it's important to,
Thank you, Tania.
Thank you.
I do understand and appreciate your wanting to deconstruct or dismantle the term aesthetics, but you're so precise about how things look, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about your relationship to maybe the word form. If aesthetics maybe has a kind of regressive valence, but I do get such a clear sense from all of your work that you think very thoughtfully about questions of design. Form.
Yeah. It's so weird because, to be honest, when I talk, I almost feel like I'm performing, because I'm showing this thing with such an uncertainty and so clarity, and these things are so complicated that one thing I have decided is I'm going to start doing talks about only one work and explaining all the complexity each of the work has, because I almost feel like I show in this way to maybe get excited about this conversation, because it's for students. I try to do as many things as possible so they, But each of these works are extremely complicated, and they mostly don't have form until they have form. I don't know how to say that. No, you know what I mean? Like during the process, for example, the piece in Colombia, it looks very precise. You have these people in a panel. It is also a critique of the left in the sense of like, God damn it, we have to put our discourse at the level of the moment and not keep this kind of old discussions. But when I was invited, I sent an email saying, they say, oh, we want to invite you. I say, okay, great. I need guns, paramilitary, and cocaine. I had no form. I had few things that I knew people envision when they talk about Colombia. So my form was not an image. My form was the prejudice people have and the preconception people have of places. That was the form I was working with. And and it clarifies and crystallized there, because I needed to be there. And then I said, okay, the guns are too much. This is so violent here, like the gun is too much. Or this is we need more things, not only the paramilitary. So I feel like the form is being done through the understanding of not only the friction, but the level of sensitivity things have. The objects and the relationship with those situations people have in place. So at some point it crystallizes, and then it's that, But it only happens after, I'm there and understand exactly what happens, and and until the last minute I can change something, because I think this is too much or too little. It's like an orchestra direction. And for example, in the piece in Cuba, I was the one directing. I had 3 people planted to talk, because I'm like, nobody's going to talk, so I need to have 3 people. I didn't say what to say. I just wanted them to promise me they will talk. And I was literally I was saying like, okay, it was like 10 minutes, like this tension. And I said, okay, we have to break the tension. And I was like, and then that person went and talked, And, so it is kind of a form that is fluid, and it's a form that has to understand its currency. As soon as it lost currency, it has to reform in a way, So that was the last thing I was going to talk about, so thank you.